So everyone, welcome. Thank you for tuning in today with us on this June 2nd afternoon. This is our third in a series of free webinars presented by Prepare.ai. If you joined either of our first two webinars, welcome back. I'm Dave Costenaro, the Technical Director of Prepare.ai with my colleague Cindy Teasdale. She's the Executive Director. In case you're new to Prepare.ai, we're a 501c3 nonprofit org whose mission is to increase collaboration around AI and other fourth industrial revolution technologies in order to advance the human experience. We're doing that right here in St. Louis, Missouri, in the heart of the Midwest. If you're having trouble viewing all of our speakers, Zoom has a grid-looking icon at the top right of the screen. You should be able to get a view of all the panelists there. You'll notice today we have a few partners online that aren't in video mode. That's Sarah McDale and David Berger with the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. They're going to help us field questions and just kind of be our eye in the sky while we're going. So we'll introduce our panelists. Before we do that, just wanted to make a brief statement. We felt it was important to acknowledge the incredible tension that's going on in our country right now, in our city. We feel that viscerally. You know, Prepare was founded on the notion that in order to thrive, we need an inclusive and equitable technology ecosystem and conversation. You know, with room at the table for all comers, regardless of who you are. We will be working in earnest to help do our part, reinventing systems that are deeply flawed. You know, our small parts come in the form of free and open forums like the one we have today. They come in the form of our workforce development work and the events that we're planning for the fall. They'll include sessions on teaching kids how to code computers, non-traditional pathways into tech careers, and how segregation and social determinants of health are impacting St. Louis's ability to thrive. So, you know, we look forward to pushing this difficult conversation forward in the months and years to come. You know, I just wanted to humbly ask for, you know, your participation, partnership, guidance, open-mindedness, and curiosity as we do that. You know, I just think that's important to say today. So now, in what's guaranteed to be an awkward transition, Cindy, can you run us through some logistics? Maybe your connection is tough. All right, well, let me see here. So we have okay, I've got a few logistics notes here to go over. Our next session is 2.5 weeks from today on June 18th. It's not a panel or a talk, but it's more of an educational workshop. We're going to be doing an introduction to R, the statistical programming language, where you can learn data science. So it's titled Learn Data Science with 10 R commands or less. So that'll be taught by Phil Milner, Advanced Financial Analytics Senior Consultant with Wells Fargo, and Christopher Schlossberg, the Senior Data Scientist with the Bayer Crop Science Division. This was originally a workshop that would have been held on day one of our Prepare.ai conference a month ago, which obviously did not happen because of the COVID situation. We're really excited and grateful that Phil and Chris are willing to run it for free. We were going to have that be a paid session, a paid training. So please sign up and invite friends. If it's successful, if that's a good format, we'd like to do more. So you can head to Prepare.ai, our website, and click on webinars and register. We'll also include a link in the follow-up email that we send out from this talk tomorrow. So now to today's sessions. So we're thrilled to have with us 3 senior National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency leaders for today's session, A Planetary Pandemic, How NGA and Others Are Using Technology to Flatten the Curve. Today's speakers are Sandra Achter, Deputy Associate Director for Capabilities, Alex Berger, National System for GeoInt Mission Manager for East Asia and Directorate of Operations, and Mark Munsell, Chief Technology Officer of the NGA. We'll begin our session by having our speakers introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll spend the first portion of our hour in a panel discussion. The second portion of the hour will be open to Q&A, so please use the Q&A function in the Zoom application to submit your questions, and we'll be looking through those and compiling them throughout the session. Remember that a lot of the NGA's work is classified, so there may be some things that we'll not be covering today. If we don't ask your question, it's likely because our panelists are not at liberty to answer. So Mark, maybe let's start with you. how long have you been the CTO? And what was your day-to-day before the pandemic, and how has that shifted?
Yeah, so I've been NGA's Chief Technology Officer for about 2 years now. Before that, several years as the Deputy Chief Information Officer. And so, how has my day-to-day been affected since the pandemic started? Um, Obviously, I stopped going into the building, stopped going into work. And so that was probably the biggest personal impact was for myself shifting and adjusting to working from home. The other big impact I guess from a professional standpoint was how do we offer the opportunity to do telework for our thousands and thousands of employees that we have, and how do we make that shift quickly and easily? And so it's interesting how that went down. I'd love to sort of expand on that as we go through the conference or as we go through the webinar here. But we made a very critical decision up front, which was to order the equipment, order the what we call CAC, Common Access Card Readers, order everything that one would need to be able to do telework from home. And we did it in the first couple of days without really knowing what was going on. We made the call that essentially for us to do this, we have to order 10,000 of these things, get them on shipment, and get them to us as soon as possible to make that shift. So I'll say widely, it's affected my office from the simple fact that we had to shift from working on the inside in classified environments to shift to working on the outside in unclassified environments. And that's a big shift for an agency like NGA.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a theme that I think we'll touch on a lot during this call. That the classified stuff that you're working with, and then the open source stuff that you need to work with, and how you mix those. So we'll definitely talk a lot about that, I think. Sandra, let's go to you. Can you say hi and tell us a little bit about your role at NGA and how that has shifted in the context of the pandemic?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So my role is the Deputy Associate Director of Capabilities. I'm part of the XCOM, the Executive Committee, the senior leaders here at NGA. And so within my portfolio, we have a number of components. So what is capabilities? So we deliver capabilities for the agency. So we create the production and development environment and resources that help support our core Achievement mission. Just like Mark, I think we had to make a major shift from really operating in a classified environment and figuring out how it is that we could manage outside of our building. So the agency senior leadership had to make decisions about how it was that we were going to operate in this new environment. I made a conscious decision when we went to reduce manning to take the opportunity to telework along with 85% of our workforce right now. So there was quite a different perspective just in terms of how it was that we looked at programming for the future, technology. Mark touched on quite a bit of that as well, and shifting our thinking about what it was that we had decided to program for 6 months ago. That has definitely shifted based on this crisis. So been in this position it'll be 2 years in November, but I celebrated my 20-year anniversary a few weeks ago. So
great.
Happy to be here.
And just for a sense of scale, about how many employees are there in St. Louis and then more broadly in the NGA?
So in St. Louis, I think it's 25% of our workforce is in St. Louis, and in Arnold, we have a facility there as well, and the rest is on the East Coast and around the world, actually. So, but those are primary facilities in Springfield and in 2nd Street. So that was another major issue too, is having to make sure that we delivered capability and technology for not just for folks that are in our primary facilities, but literally around the world. And Mark's team and a lot of the folks that are within my portfolio did a Herculean job in making sure that we were able to create that environment so people could operate in the open.
Great. All right, and let's say hi to Alex, our third panelist here. Same question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about your role and how that's shifted with the onslaught of COVID-19?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. So I am currently the Joint Mission Manager for East Asia. So mission managers at NGA really serve in an integration role. Previous to that, I was actually an office director where I owned analysts who actually looked at imagery of China and Korea. And so I was very comfortable in that role, but there were a fair number, almost half of the analysts across NGA who look at China and North Korea don't actually work in that office. And so NGA created these new positions called mission managers who were supposed to look across all of NGA and really use mission to focus and prioritize that work. What I spent most of my time doing was looking at things like tradecraft to make sure that we were using common approaches to answering intelligence questions, using technology to its best advantage, and then making sure that policies were in place that we could work easily and quickly, even to include the wider geospatial intelligence enterprise, such as our foreign partners. And then really trying to prioritize the work and make sure that strategically we were focused on the right things. I've been in this role for about 2.5 years, mainly, as I said, working China and North Korea. And as the COVID-19 disease emerged as a global pandemic, I was asked to take on the crisis manager role for COVID, partially because it started in China and that was my region, but also this really fell in a seam within our agency and many other government agencies where we are typically either looking abroad at places, foreign countries, and trying to understand things about those countries that maybe they're trying to hide from us. And then occasionally we will support operations in the United States, and I'll explain some of that later. But this was one of the first that I'd seen in my 30 years in intelligence where it had both an international and a very, very strong domestic impact. And so really to pull that entire mission together, that the entire agency, they asked that I serve in this temporary role as the crisis manager for the COVID-19 response. Add to that the complexity of having to manage a workforce that's in various stages of quarantine and lockdown at the multiple different locations that we have our people. And then understanding that our customers needed the information that we had. And so that became the challenge that we faced. Technology has really been an enabler to pull all that together. But I think one of the things we're going to talk about is how challenging that has been for an intelligence agency to pivot to working in that unclassed space.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. All right, so we've said hello. I think, members and attendees in the audience, I think you'll see like we've got a wide breadth of expertise represented here for the NGA. So put your thinking caps on and get some questions coming if they're occurring to you. Mark, I wanted to ask you to take us back up to 30,000 feet here. Can you just give us an overview of the NGA mission and then talk about what is that baseline, and then how does that shift in the context of a global emergency like this pandemic?
Sure. So NGA is an intelligence agency, right? So think of all the other intelligence agencies that you know and understand from movies or from fiction and reality, I guess.
Mark, understanding intelligence agencies, you use that term loosely, I think.
Yeah, but we're also a combat support agency. And so it's both of those things. And we'll talk, Alex, we get to talk about this, and so is Sandra. But essentially we are, it's not this simple, but we'll try to simplify it. It's kind of like the National Security Agency is considered like the ears of the country. You could say that NGA is kind of like the eyes of the country, right? So we specialize in analyzing imagery, a broad category that we call geospatial intelligence that includes a bunch of different sources. But just for a second, think imagery, think satellite imagery, but it's not solely confined to that. We take that information and we, in the process of analyzing it, turn it into hopefully valuable intelligence to inform decision makers, so policymakers, the President of the United States, military commanders when they're trying to make strategic decisions, tactical commanders when they're trying to operate on the battlefield, all the way to safety of navigation for our Department of Defense assets. So it's very interesting. NGA covers a very broad spectrum of intelligence and geospatial information. And I'll give this one example. Everyone's device, everyone's iPhone, Android device has in it products from NGA to include the World Magnetic Model is in all your devices. And what it does is when you stand on the street corner and you're using your GPS in your device, it basically figures out from true north and the magnometer in your device to magnetic north, the magnometer in your device to true north. It actually calculates that for you every time that calculation is made on your phone. That's just one example of the sort of fundamental kind of service that NGA provides to not only the United States, but to the world.
That's awesome. Okay, so that helps. Alex, can we go and ask you to describe what a mission manager, you mentioned that is your role. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I know there are a lot of things you can't talk about with respect to the agency's efforts, but maybe you can share how you worked on epidemics in the past, like Ebola, and how geospatial technology can be used to track the virus in ways that average layperson may not be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. So NGA is a member of the intelligence community, and as Mark mentioned, the combat support agency. And in doing that, we have a very large focus in monitoring pretty much the entire globe using remote sensing techniques such as imaging satellites to really understand what our adversaries are up to. And that's a pretty traditional intelligence role. We support the all source agencies like the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency in that. But we also have a very unique role in supporting other things like humanitarian and disaster response, and even events like the Olympics. So the techniques and the tools of the trade that we use for those things are actually common to the intelligence mission that we have. So for example, for Olympic support, our mission is to support the State Department in protecting athletes and American citizens, but also the host governments to ensure that they have the best information available to protect the venues and the athletes. So we use things like LiDAR to really map out the stadiums and the different facilities and create that 3D model that is very effective for things like viewshed analysis, the line of sight that's useful for security and other things. We also create products for humanitarian and disaster response. So we're able to, for example, with a hurricane, we can use viewshed analysis again on terrain data to understand the low-lying areas that might be inundated during flooding or something like a typhoon, so that we can provide that warning ahead of time and we can get that information to first responders so that they can anticipate where they might have to jump into action. And then for something like a disease outbreak, again, we're really talking about large volumes of data and then making sense of that data and then exposing it and making it available quickly in usually very short timelines or unusual circumstances. So in 2014, NJ was asked to provide support to international partners, to US government agencies, and even to non-governmental organizations to understand what became the largest outbreak of Ebola since it had been discovered in 1976. And so NGA jumped in first by creating a public-facing webpage. So very often our information is held in classified systems. Sometimes our information can go to unclassified for official use only. It really is only able to go to government agencies. But then in something like a disease outbreak, we actually push that information all the way down to the unclassified level and put that on systems that are available to everyone through the www so that they can get access to that information. So for example, we created a public-facing webpage with access to layers of data. So think maps, think infrastructure. It was hosted on an Esri ArcGIS platform, which is a fairly commonly used geospatial information systems platform. And it was hosted in the cloud by Amazon Web Services, which Mark may talk about. So again, using the existing technology, the technology that other groups use for GIS, NGA was using and participating in. I've mentioned that we exposed layers of relevant data, terrain data, infrastructure data, and even things like sociocultural data, because that had impacts on things like linguistic challenges that responding humanitarian disaster response organizations would face. And then really our job also is to do analysis to answer questions that people might have. And the whole theme of questions will come up again, because data and technology is just a tool to answer questions. So for example, one of the questions during the Ebola outbreak was, why isn't Ebola spreading to neighboring countries from the West African countries that it started in? And we were able to support the theory that poor infrastructure and rainy weather, which was creating flooding, was actually a pretty significant cause to making it challenging to do disaster response, but also limiting the spread of human populations that is a vector for transmitting the disease. Another kind of interesting tidbit that folks wouldn't know, so NGA has a very significant role in geographic naming. And so you take for granted the names that we call things. But what we found is that in foreign countries, very often there's a formal name that might be on a map, and some of the maps that US government agencies were deploying with really dated back to the colonial era, the British colonial era in West Africa. And so when reports come in that we need to deliver supplies or conduct a rescue somewhere, if we don't have the right names, it becomes very difficult to provide that support or find the locations. And so NGA has a team of 40 human geographers who spent months going through features and names and made 20,000 updates to the maps and location data, which was critical. We got feedback from the partners that was really critical to delivering the aid in a timely manner. So that's a little known fact, but again, because we're really geospatial at heart and we're really geographers and cartographers and remote sensing experts, but then in the modern era, using these technology tools to more quickly deliver information. That was actually the first use of the public-facing webpage to give that timely updates. In the past, we would have just printed out volumes of materials and it would have been static as of when the folks left. And then, of course, we send deployers out. So in this case, the 101st Airborne Division of the Army was asked to go into West Africa to provide support to the host nations. And so we sent an NGA person there to ensure that they had reach back to all of NGA's resources, but also that those Army units could do quick on-the-spot assessments of things like helicopter landing zones and things like that, again, using the technology tools that we have available. Just one last postscript. So as of this morning, I was at work this morning, and our intelligence update that we give every day to our director included an update on what is now the 11th outbreak of Ebola in Africa. So this was not a one and done. We continue to monitor things like this. And if this outbreak were to turn into something that would require assistance, we would be there as well.
So just recently, there is now an Ebola outbreak.
Right, yep. World Health Organization is providing updates, but it's, yeah, it's the 11th outbreak. Possibly somewhat contained. I think it's been a month since the latest case, and I think 2 months without cases declares it done. So my guess is this one won't turn into a large outbreak like the ones we've supported, but again, we have a very broad mission and we have to pivot to support whatever the requirements are.
Gotcha, thank you. Sandra, let's ask you a couple questions about the workforce response at NGA. You were involved in getting NGA's workforce remote and work from home for the coronavirus situation. You know, as you all are a government agency, one that typically works in highly classified environments, that shift must have been very difficult. You know, more different and more difficult and challenging than what I'm going through and what I think a lot of our attendees are. Can you share what you all did to protect your own workforce while keeping them up and running towards their missions, and what will you be doing on a go-forward basis to balance safety of your employees and safety of the country and the mission? How are you thinking about that?
Sure. I think, again, it was a major shift for all of us. And I spent the majority of my 20 years within operations and analysis. And this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to telework. It is different. And I'm not the only one. There's quite a few folks that work at our agency that have never sort of been outside of our top secret SCIF within their buildings. So, but we had to pay attention and do our patriotic duty and follow the stay-at-home orders.
Sandra, real quick, can you define a SCIF for the
Oh,
label?
sorry. A SCIF is basically an enclosed environment where you can have classified material, and it's to stay within that vault, essentially. You basically either have to badge in or put in a cipher code in order for you to be in there, and you have to have a certain clearance to be able to be allowed into that space, which has implications for what I'm going to be talking about, just in terms of how it is that we needed to account for and monitor the health and safety of the workforce. So, we had to follow the stay-at-home orders. The director, Admiral Sharp, directed us to go to minimal manning in March to under 25%. So what we had to do with our GEOINT mission managers, working with our operations seniors in analysis and source primarily, was determine what missions were critical that we needed to continue to have a presence in our building. So we identified who those mission critical personnel were for those missions. And then everybody else was going to be in a telework capacity. At that point, we had not identified anyone who had tested positive, but we knew that was going to happen. And we needed to ensure that the folks that were inside and outside the building, but our folks definitely that were within 2nd Street and NCE, we were able to do contact tracing, essentially a microcosm of the efforts that were being done at a national level. So when I talk about contact tracing, I'm talking about figuring out where a person was in our facility once they badge in, who they were in contact with within a certain time period. So for us, it was 14 days, and then where exactly they had been when they were in our facilities. And so Mark gave you kind of an example of what our core missions are. Our director likes to say that he was a former targeter, and he likes to say that he's interested in finding and taking out evil in time and space. For us, we were taking and applying those same principles and methodologies to look for evil, which was COVID-19, within our facilities. So we had our data professionals look at our internal data that we collected when folks batched into a building. And when I talked about that SCIF before too, again, all of the data that's collected when somebody goes into that SCIF area. We had to rely at the beginning on interviews with folks once we started getting folks testing positive for COVID. But we knew it wasn't going to be enough, and that we weren't going to always be lucky enough to be able to actually have interviews with personnel to determine where they've been when they'd last been in the building, and we needed to supplement that data. So our team created a tool that had a shapefile of our computer login data along with our badging data, and we were able to combine those to be able to have a more efficient, effective way of doing contract tracing. It's been a challenge, and we'll talk about that a little bit more just in terms of what it was that we had to do to connect data that was internal to our agency that was being housed in different directorates for different purposes. We'd never faced a pandemic like this, and it was definitely a challenge. But we needed to make sure that we were able to, if we identified where somebody was in our building, the protocols that we had for sanitizing that area, we needed to be as accurate as possible. We also knew initially too that we would have to support our medical staff. We've got epidemiologists on staff who needed to do advanced infection cluster analysis. Again, monitoring and making sure that there are not spikes within the workforce, and then we would have to adjust our footprint within the building.
Great, thank you. Mark, along those lines, it sounds like this shift has been a surprisingly positive one in terms of pushing the agency out of the SCIFs, these secure compartmentalized facilities, to environments where partnering with organizations might now be a lower barrier to entry. Can you share some examples of those partnerships?
Yeah, no, this is awesome actually for us. And I'll back up just a second and say that, you know, we did have a running start at this. So even though we made some big decisions and when this started in early March that we had to sort of shift our employees to be able to do unclassified telework, we had a good running start of this about 3 or 4 years ago. We had some efforts that were started by our former director, Robert Cardillo, and Sue Gordon to operate more in the open. And from my side, on the technology side, that effort really consisted of developing software, developing systems, building systems in the unclassified environment, and then moving those systems to the classified environment. We called it build low, move high. And we got a good running start of that. And it was really important for a couple of reasons. One, to get familiar with the way the unclassified world does business, especially in building technology, right? Working in the cloud and working in Amazon Web Services, as Alex said earlier. And that really was healthy for us. That was really healthy for the people that we hired to come in and work on that. That was really healthy for our contractors because we were getting this mix of people that work in the unclassified environment, that work as commercial software developers, and inject them into our processes, 4 or 5 years ago. So that was our running start leading up to this. And so now, having matured that, and really, I'll say once we hit this pandemic, is really a shot in the arm. And it was really important for people that were staying on the classified side to experience what it was like to work in the open. That effect and the way it changed people, the way, Alex is smiling, and I know Sandra's smiling, it's changed people, and it's given them more empathy for the people that were trying to work in an unclassified environment. So with all of that said, it is the new normal for us, right? We are going to change the way that we do business, and there's so many good things that are coming from this. One of those is the expansion of who we work with. This is really going to expand our base of technologists, expand our base of analysts that we work with, and companies, large and small, give them the opportunity to work with us where, they don't take 3 or 4 years to get their company cleared. They don't take 2 years to get their principals, company officers cleared, and everything it takes to sort of get a company involved in this business. It takes years. And so now the opportunity is to work in an environment, work in the unclassified environment with folks as part of everyday industry, and to find the ones that really are compatible with us, find the ones that do want to work with us, and get them started in this environment. It's really going to change the way, it's really changing the future of the way we work.
I can't see Mark, but I'm going to jump in here if that's okay. Too. I think I can't overstate enough the tremendous difference that this has made and the impact that this has had on our workforce. We are committed. Our director is committed to us making sure that we're not losing the good here that we've made investments in terms of working in the open. Our analysts are exposed to data and parts of industry that they had not been exposed to before. They don't want to lose those connections. And I think that I keep hearing from my mentees about how much they can do in the open. They were pleasantly surprised. And these are grizzled vets who had zero interest a few years ago when we were trying to make this push to operate in the open, and they can see how valuable that's been. Compared to our sister agencies, in terms of meaningful telework, I think NGA is far out ahead, and there's some instances that you're just not able to do that. I think we take pride in the fact that we're going to be able to maintain and create an environment where we are going to be able to operate in the open, and it sort of makes you closer to the people that you're working for, right? So it does make a difference. Thanks for letting me jump in there, Mark.
That's awesome. And I hope you all can hear me okay. I think we actually lost Dave. Apparently this is our tech challenge webinar. So Alex, we're gonna move to you. You know, you've said NGA is really a data organization. Can you share more about what that means and what kind of data you all are looking at and analyzing in the context of COVID?
Yeah, sure. No, it really is an exciting time, and I would say that you know, one of the silver linings of much of this is that we have been forced to think about many of the missions that we perform differently. But really, kind of going back to NGA and its predecessor organizations, at its core, NGA is both a cartography agency and a remote sensing agency. And both of those are both art and science. And so if you think about cartography, really the tools and technology have changed, but it's always been about layering data. So you might start with a terrain data, and then you'll add political boundaries, and then you add infrastructure like roads and rail, and then you add population centers like cities. And then the intelligence piece very often is what we collect and hold close, which is the human activity. And very often human activity related to military operations or things that our adversaries are doing to try to take advantage or prepare themselves. So that art of layering data, that cartography root is still strong within NGA. And then the other piece of it is that we very often use remote sensing capabilities. In the past, it was classified satellites, but now with the commercialization of space, we're being exposed to more and more content that is being collected in a very similar way and is being exposed widely. And the analytic techniques are emerging in the outside. So in addition to NGA having to change because of the fact that we just can't go into our classified building, we've also known that we've needed to change to better partner with those who are doing the same thing we're doing, but in the outside world. So in many ways, NGA was postured very well to support something like COVID-19, because there are a number of questions that are being asked that have national security implications because of the global pandemic nature of this disease. And many of those things deal with human activities and human populations, to include how the disease is spreading or not spreading, and to include things like what is the impact on military readiness of our adversaries. And not just what we imagine it might be, because there's a term in the intelligence business called mirror imaging, where we think if it's happening to us, it's probably happening to somebody else. But then you have to understand that some countries are used to being faced with pandemic flu outbreak. Some countries are not as reliant on electricity or internet service to conduct their operations. And so really this has been an opportunity for us. In the past, the US would be asked might be asked to provide support to a lead federal agency to support operations in the US. So I talked about things like event support. And again, we take off our intelligence hat and put on our GIS hat when we're serving in that role for a US lead federal agency. So in this case, we could have supported USAID if USAID had engaged in any kind of overseas humanitarian assistance. And in this case, the US lead federal agency for the United States is Health and Human Services. But this is actually a good news story in that NGA had worked with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they learned how to do GIS the way that we did. And they deal with unclassified data and they deal with unclassified issues, but the technology and the tradecraft is similar. And so for years, we actually provided direct support to FEMA and other agencies like Health and Human Services. But in this particular case, they didn't need our help. So Health and Human Services partnered with FEMA and the Centers for Disease Control to really provide that geospatial support within the US. And so we see that as a good thing. We see that as a win because then we were able to pivot our resources to look at other things that those organizations weren't looking at. But one very interesting thing we noted early on, and so as the crisis manager for COVID support, I was monitoring requests as they came in from various parts of the government. And many of the questions that were being asked were for data and services that NGA could have provided had we needed to do that. But in many cases, academia and industry was already providing solutions. And so we made a conscious decision not to compete with those organizations. So if you think of the Johns Hopkins COVID-19 Resource Center, many of us are familiar with the portal that Johns Hopkins pulled together. They partnered with Esri for the viewer, and they pulled data from the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization. And they provided that early on. And you might remember early versions were sort of global, and it listed the number of cases and the number of deaths. And it had a heat map that showed visually the spread of the disease. And then over time, they brought in other layers of data, such as US down to the county level. And then they used the data to answer questions like, what does the pandemic look like in our state? And you can go on there today, and the data that they're using are deaths, cases, and trending over time. And again, it's presented very visually and intuitively. And so instead of NGA having to provide that, there was another solution out there. And so when we received requests, because it's easy for DoD organizations to task NGA, easier than tasking industry or academia, we actually pushed them to that presence because we said we can't do better than what's out there already. And so that was also sort of a new thing for everybody, both our customers and for us. It took a lot of discipline for us not to jump in because we love to depict data in time and space. But most of our tools available to do that are on classified systems where the people who needed it couldn't get to it. The other kind of interesting thing that has really been in the press, and I'll just touch on it, is things like social distancing measures. And there are a number of different places you can go to visually see social distancing data. You've seen the social distancing scorecard put out by Unicast, it's a company, and then the OpenPath Social Distancing Index. And those are visualizations of various data sources that score regions on how well they are socially distancing or not, based on anonymized, unclassified cell phone data that comes out of apps that we use today and cell data. And even in one case, the OpenPath is using national building access logs. So again, going out and finding data wherever it is and then bringing it in, conditioning it and presenting it to answer questions. That's really fascinating. And again, that's the tradecraft that we've often used to answer intelligence questions, taking data, conditioning the data, and then querying the data to answer questions. Most of our questions tend to be classified intelligence questions, but in this case, it's things that can help decision-making about reopening and reconstitution plans, like where are the outbreaks, what are the trend lines, and how well are people complying with social distancing. We didn't get involved in that space because it was already being served pretty well, and the national decision makers had access to that data. You may also be aware that other countries, South Korea is sort of an exemplar that's been held up by the media in using contact tracing, anonymized cell phone data, that if an individual tests positive for COVID, an alert can go out alerting anybody who had spent time near that person. And again, the developers define the timeline, so I believe it's within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes. But then everybody who's near them would get an alert on their cell phone. And that's a very technology way to do what's been done by human beings for probably 200 years manually, which is really contact tracing is the technique, and then technology can aid that. But we're very aware that there's a public debate going on right now about how comfortable people are, because it's always a debate between privacy and security, or in this case, public health. We're not involved in that discussion, but I find it really fascinating because it is sort of this convergence of analysis and predictive analysis and using models and tools. So happy to talk more about that, but I'll end there.
Great.
Awesome.
I dropped off there for a minute. Cindy, did you?
Welcome back.
And thank you. So where should we pick up?
I will ask the next question and then I'll hand things back. Oh, I think with Sandra. So we were going to ask, along the line of data collection and analysis, you mentioned in our prep call a data labeling effort that the agency had been working on, and I thought it would be interesting if you could share a bit more on that.
Sure. We have what we call AAA, which is AI automation and augmentation. It's a cross-functional team that's focused on really advancing our ability to be able to operate using AI, automation, and augmentation. AI has been proven very difficult, but one of the things that we're needing to do in order to be able to leverage AI, machine learning, and computer vision is to create training data. There are lots of different ways that you can do it. In China, they're leveraging their population. So they've got thousands of people that are labeling data all the time. We're not at that space where we can do that. But we're doing it to a much smaller degree. So we're partnering with the Defense Department to look at commercial data and figuring out how it is that we can start to label to enable our AI efforts. Again, one of the silver linings in this terrible crisis, this pandemic, is that we've been able to jumpstart that with our folks that have been teleworking, and so we were able to provide them accounts. They were able to download imagery. We had projects for them for looking at primarily what we call foundational military intelligence and order of battle, airplanes, etc. And it's basically to teach machines to be able to identify that. To date, I think we've had over, it's like 500,000 images that have been labeled so far. And I think we've just made tremendous progress again with partnering with the team that had started this before. But yeah, we're working, our research directorate is working to figure out how it is that we can have computers start to create those data sets, but we're just going to have to work those in parallel.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, anytime there's a new technology, sometimes it automates some other jobs, but it will create a new job like this data labeling. You need a coach or a trainer for the machines to say, like, what is a thing? What is this thing? What is this? What is that? So let's, Mark, I want to ask you one more question in our kind of prepared script of the bullet points that we had talked through in our prep call. And then we can get into audience Q&A. I know we've had some folks asking already, and we're compiling those. But Mark, a lot of us in St. Louis we've been seeing news about NGA's new West headquarters over the last few months. Can you share an update on the progress and how anything might be changing?
Yeah, so it's really exciting. We really haven't lost any schedule or any time frame due to COVID. We've been preparing the lot, and activity continues to progress there. You see lots of the new structures going up there. They're construction management trailers and things like that. We set up all the comms, security to the facility. So it's really progressing. So it's exciting to see actual activity on the site. And what we're doing now is sort of trying to figure out how we can project to the community what we think 2025 will be like once we're there and once we're in the new facility. And so we're looking for ways to stand up an innovation center in the downtown technology district and invite companies in to work with us, build a software lab there in the downtown innovation district, and basically begin interacting with the community on high-tech projects in an unclassified environment to kind of show the way to kind of work out the model of working in that unclassified environment in the downtown area. So that's really exciting too. I think you'll see announcements on that in the near future on what our plans are for the Innovation Center and what our plans are to start some accelerators in the area. That's going to be awesome. We're gonna sponsor a few contests for companies and universities to come in and take a look at some of our problems and have them propose solutions to that, as well as again, like I said, sort of start a software lab downtown to get people involved in some of our high tech ventures.
Fantastic. Look forward to that. So here's a couple Q&A items that have rolled in. Alex, you already talked about this, but just a real quick answer, and I think we'll have to be quick with these just because of time. One of the audience members says, I've seen a lot of heat maps of COVID spread. Have you done any work tracking the directional spread, a time-lapse story, if you will?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we weren't asked for directional. We've been asked several questions early on. We were just asked to visualize and track which countries were limiting travel to and from China or completely locked off travel. And again, this was to inform local decisions about protecting military forces and things like that. Over time, we received questions based on the visualization of data. So Africa, for example, didn't seem to be as affected because the heat map didn't show as many red dots or as large dots. But again, then, I'm sure we have many scientists online, data scientists or others. I, like Sandra Octor, was a political scientist, and I was told that data is useful, but doesn't really answer questions. And so there were so many theories as to why Africa wasn't being affected. Was it the heat or the desert environment, things like that? And truthfully, it was the fact that they hadn't begun testing and that the medical system wasn't aligned yet to capture and report the data. And so, it is a lesson that you really have to take the questions and then understand the methodology and the data you have available, and then be really honest about that. So those things like directional flow, or even things like anticipating where future outbreaks might be occurring, there's so many variables involved that it really requires a marrying up your analysts and your data folks to make sure that you have the right data. You can use the data to answer the question, that you're clear on what information might change your analysis. And I've been watching with great interest the debate we're having about predictive models and, for example, the number of deaths and what that means for social distancing or lockdowns. Data is just data, and technology is just technology, both extremely important, but the decision-making is really what we're all here to serve.
Great. Here's another one from Robert Gunther. He says, first, thank you for providing this forum. Question for the panel. There's a Canadian company, Blue Dot, that reported on New Year's Eve there were 27 cases of a strange illness in Wuhan. So that was an early indicator. How early did you all feel there was an issue? How early were you tracking?
Yeah, I can jump in, and then not sure if the other panelists will. So I'm very familiar with Blue Dot. There was a great 60-minute special that featured Esri and Blue Dot. So a shout out to that if you haven't seen it. And Blue Dot's a company that uses data to anticipate where outbreaks might occur. So the timelines, obviously won't get too much into it. There's a lot of discussion about who knew what when. What I can say is that China was publicly talking about the outbreak in late December, and by early January, I remember reading reports about how the Wuhan market was suspected to be a possible origin. Now again, won't get into too much detail, but the Blue Dot is really good at using data to not only identify kind of where it started, but also where it might actually spread. But from what I know, the timelines are pretty consistent with what China was reporting to the international community.
Great. So, okay, let's end on this one, just for maybe all three of you. What are the top handful of things that you see, hey, I need to be doing this as the country and the world begins to open back up? What are the top couple things on your mind to help us achieve that vision at NGA? Maybe Mark, we can start with you if you've got.
So let me make sure I got the question right. So what as a country, as a collective, as a human race?
Right? Yeah. No.
Yeah,
I guess so. From your perspective, Mark, like where you're sitting,
yeah.
like what are your biggest priorities with your capacity at NGA? Like, hey, these are the things that I need to be doing to help the NGA's mission, and as the
Yeah,
world
yeah,
opens back up.
I got you. So, from a tactical point of view, we have to get ready for the workforce to come back, and so we've actually have an effort called Operation Red Carpet, and the intent of that is to make sure that, I mean, some of these systems have been dormant. Some of them, some of the desktops have been turned off for 2 months, almost 3 months. Some of the back end systems that we've had might not have had the use, you know, the logs are filling up. So there's a lot of work from an IT point of view to make sure that our workforce is ready to come back, to make sure that the systems work, and to make sure that we're operating in full capacity for them to do that. So from that perspective, it's a lot of technical work to get ready. I mean, then there's the human perspective. And I think the other panelists will talk about this, but I'll just hit it lightly before we go on. You know, we have people that are at higher risk. We have people that have experienced deaths in their family. We have people that have been sick, and so, you know, we really have to. I mean, our agency's in the business of protecting our country, and we also have to protect the force, right? It's a term that we use. We have to make sure that our workforce is sound, and that our workforce is prepared and mentally healthy to do this. And so there's a lot of thought that's going into how to prepare the workforce and how to take care of the workforce as we begin to go back to work. I'll end it there and pass it on.
It's great. Appreciate that.
Jump in. I think for me, not just for us, but for our audience members and listeners, understanding data, right? I think Alex touched on some of the data that we're actually using to determine what are the triggers that we need to look at in order for us to start bringing folks back safely. But creating an environment and teaching so that workforce and the workforce and our leaders, especially folks that are making decisions, are data literate. What do I mean by that? So understand data in general, what data that you have that's available, where you can find it, and how to query it, right? We had a lot of data collects, just figuring out how it is that we were going to move the workforce from out of our buildings and to move them back in. And Mark knows how I feel about this particular data call that we had, where we had an Excel spreadsheet with 800 plus entries in it of text, right? So that's not, we can't really leverage and use that data. A lot of good information in there. But we were able to take our data core, they were able to visualize that data, take the text, look at trends and patterns, and display it in a way that I could say, oh, this is very interesting to see that this wasn't deemed mission essential and we're not doing any telework with that as well. Is this something that once we move back into the building, we have to really look at and say, is this an activity that we need to continue? But there's been a lot of data that's been out there just in terms of contract tracing and for understanding where this virus started and how it's spreading. And to the extent that people can be data literate and really understand the integrity of that data, I think is important.
Yeah, it's super important. Thank you. Alex, how about you? What would you say?
I'm multitask. So this chat and answer at the same time.
Oh, right.
So I'm sorry, could you repeat the question just so I have it clear in my head?
So just want to know what you're thinking about. What are your top handful of things that as the world opens back up, like, hey, I need to be doing X, Y, and Z to help us open back up safely?
Yeah, that's great. I need a haircut, first of all.
Yeah.
Apparently I'm not the only guy who is marveling at how my hair has grown out. So I have been in a unique position of sort of seeing COVID from the very beginnings as it emerged in China and then spread globally, and then now sort of watching with interest how we reconstitute. In my mission manager role, I'm helping to prioritize the missions that we need to get back to first. one of the questions in the chat room was about how do we protect classified information if we're working from home. There's a lot of work that we're not able to do from home and probably never will be, or at least not in my imagination, although my imagination has been expanded as Mark talked about. But really, my role has in helping return, and not just me, but the team of mission managers and senior analysts that we work with, is to really help us figure out how do we phase back in, how do we catch up on things that we've maybe lost the ability to monitor over time. Because with our skeleton crew that we've had working who are mission essential, we've only been able to monitor the most critical things, the things that present a clear and present danger to the United States. I am a huge fan of data analytics, and we've had an effort for about 10 years to try to translate pixels into relational database inputs so that we can run queries against the data. And I wouldn't say it's exactly big data, because those who deal in millions of records would probably laugh at some of the records, but it's a way that we've been using to capture knowledge and not just have it in the head of an analyst, which is sort of how we've operated for many decades. And now we've interrupted the data entry because we've had so few people in the building. So one of my priorities is making sure that where we have a good stream of data that we can run analytics to identify changes in patterns. If training happens the same time every year, we want to know that. And if there's a training that's out of cycle, that becomes an intelligence warning that we provide. So really thinking through how do we continue to do things differently, because I don't think we've seen the end of this, and we don't want to go back to working in our classified building and having such a hard time operating in the open. But at the same time, how do we reconstitute those things that we disrupted for the past several months? We're not unique in that. I think everybody's going to be facing that, but it's an exciting time, and I really like being a leader at NGA where I can help influence that.
That's fantastic. That's great. Well, I think that kind of runs us up a little bit past our time here. Mark, Sandra, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned a lot about the NGA, and I think it was a very interesting conversation. We got a lot of good interaction on the Q&A, so I think the attendees and folks felt the same. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. And again, we'll send out some notes and follow-ups to this to everyone going forward. So yeah, thanks so much, and have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks to Prepare.ai for giving us the opportunity to talk today. It was great.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Pleasure.
thanks guys. Awesome.
Thank you.